Hi, I'm Bernadette Martinez, and this is Annette Garcia.
If you're a native New Mexican, you'll want to watch the special program, Hidden Heritage of New Mexico, Then and Now, the 400-year-old secret. This is a fascinating story with a life-saving message. Bernadette, tell us about it.
This is a story of our people and our ancestors. Many of the original colonists came to New Mexico with a secret they kept so well that it was almost forgotten. And now the secret has been revealed. But even more interesting is that there is a secret within the secret. And the revelation of this secret will save lives. Sounds like a mystery. So let's get on with this mystery by introducing our first guest. Dr. Delfino Sanchez has been tracking this secret, this awakening of the Hispanic crypto-Jews, for 2 decades. Prior to this, he served at various university faculties throughout the U.S. and later built a TV station in San Antonio, Texas, where he pastored a church. Del and his wife Helen have done research and made presentations on this subject all across America, as well as in Mexico, Spain, and Israel. Dr. Sanchez, welcome to this program.
Hi, my name is Del Sanchez, and I'd like to talk to you about a mighty phenomenal awakening of crypto-Jews, namely hidden Jews, here in the state of New Mexico. And I want to share with you about the blessing of embracing your own history. For the last 2 decades, I've witnessed the increasing awakening of Anusim, that is those that are Hispanics, that are of a Sephardic ancestry, the descendants of the secret Jews of Spain. And this is a worldwide phenomenon, by the way. In fact, this awakening among our people has scaled all the way up to the halls of the Israeli government and academia. It so happened that in March 2011, there was a conference, and the title of that conference among the super elite leaders in Israel was The Phenomenal Awakening of Secret Jews / Anusim. That's the crypto Jews I'm referring to. For the last few years, I've observed that New Mexican crypto Jews are the ones that have kept the flame of this truth glowing for many, many generations. Now, by crypto Jew, I'm referring to the Anusim, as I said, who, as I said, and I want to make very clear, the descendants, and how far descendants are, could be generations or centuries of the secret Jews from Spain and from Portugal. They're finally unmasking false labels that were placed upon our people, representing us as if we were, say, Spanish or Mexican or melting pot assimilationists or Latin, when in fact, we are the descendants, many of you are descendants of the secret Jews of Spain. All these false identities have distanced our people from the truth of our ancestral heritage and also of our destiny. We have unearthed incredible oral histories, as well as genealogies and material objects that have been hidden for a long time, and people are finally discovering that they too have Jewish roots, that is, as descendants of Spain, Jews from Spain. We've had major breakthroughs here in the last, say, decade or two. In some of the recent breakthroughs are discovered in genetic DNA testing, where that many Hispanics are discovering that they have some semblance or some similarity to Sephardic Jews internationally, not just here in our country. We've even discovered a few Cohens, that is, of the line of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Yes, the Moses of the Bible, of the great Exodus. We found a line of Kohanim, that is, of the high priesthood. Not many, but you have about 3 to 5% among Ashkenazi Jews and 3 to 5% among our people, the Sephardim. I've observed that the numbers of crypto Jews, the Anusim, are far greater today than they were predicted, say, some years ago, a decade or two ago. I've personally seen there are millions of Hispanics who have Jewish roots in the United States, and tens of millions of these people across the whole Western Hemisphere. That includes all the way down to South America, the Caribbean islands and nations. In past years, we just didn't know what we were looking for or what we were looking at, but now we do know. Throughout our entire hemisphere of the USA, and as I said, the Americas, I have witnessed small encampments of crypto Jews that are coming out from hiding. This awakening has become so widespread that it has aroused the Israeli government to take note of our people as ourselves here in the USA. Personally, I want to know not only that we're here, but how and when we got here. That is my concern, and I think that that's your concern as well. I am persuaded that the knowledge of this will link us to our Jewish forefathers and not mythical labels of the past, false labels and false delusions. So in a brief topographical view, I want to give you some highlights of where we come from, how we got here, and so forth. It was around 4,000 years ago that God called Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees, which is ancient Babylon, all right, to be the father of the Hebrew nation. Abraham was a descendant of Sem, one of Noah's 3 sons. Now let's briskly jump 1,000 years forward. Within the same line of Sem or Semites to King David and King Solomon. And by the way, it is this term Sem where you get the travesty of anti-Sem or anti-Semitic. So King Solomon would send, along with King Hiram of the Phoenician Empire, fleets of ships every 3 years to Tarshish to bring back gold and silver, exotic animals, exotic fruits, and so forth. This ancient Tarshish is none other than Sephard. You must say, what's Sephard? Sephard is Spain. Even to this date, Spain is Sephard. And from there you derive the term Sephardic or Sephardim that are the initial ancestors of Jews in Spain, that's Sephard. The prophet Obadiah talks about the term Sephard specifically in verse 20 of his 1-chapter book. So we take another quick leap forward of 500 years from Solomon, the king, and we find a monstrous crisis that's taking place that launches or catapults Jews out from Israel into Sephard, which is Spain. I'm referring to the Babylonian captivity of 586 before Common Era, or BC. And so Jerusalem and the temple were burned and destroyed down to the ground. At that time, a lot of the Jews fled the exile from Israel, all right, fled the captivity. Instead of going to Babylon with the captives, they went to Sephard. So that was another initiating point of how our people begin to get to Sephard, which is Spain. So seeing how there was a strong community of Jews in Spain since the days of Solomon, multitudes of Jews continued to flee there for survival. So in other words, the community of Sephardim were prospering, they were multiplying in the place of Sephard, which is Spain. Now, then we see the travesty of the Roman legion coming and destroying Jerusalem again in the 1st century of this Common Era, or AD. They destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, and burned it down to the ground. So many more Jews fled to Sephard, to Spain, during this time of sadness and grave destruction. Instead of going into slave camps throughout Europe, they fled this usurping of power, and they fled into Spain. So many of them, however, were murdered, they were forced into slave camps, and so forth. On the other hand, while in Spain, Sephardim was now beginning to prosper and to flourish. During this time, Sephardic Jews made incredible contributions to the sciences, to medicine, to philosophy, theology, navigation, to business and finance. There was wealth, there was aristocracy, and so forth. It was during this time period that the Bible was translated literally first from Hebrew into Espanol y Ladino, into Spanish and Ladino, which is the Judeo-Spanish language of our ancestors. The fact is that 4 aristocrats that were Sephardic were the ones that funded Christopher Columbus's sailing across the ocean blue in 1492, 4 voyages. The fact is that these 4 are Abravanel, Señor, Santangel, and there you have a Sanchez as well. Now, talking about Christopher Columbus, what I've been saying for about 2 decades has recently become common knowledge that Christopher Columbus's real name is more like Cristóbal Colón or Cristoforo Colón. And so a lot of people don't know, but I'm sharing this with you. He was a converso, meaning he too was a crypto-Jew or a Jew in hiding. It so happens that the majority of the passengers on La Niña, La Pinta, and La Santa Maria, his fleet of ships, were of our kind of surname. What kind of surname? Hispanic surnames, Spanish surnames. A brief sampling of a brief, because he brought a lot of these crypto-Jews in 4 voyages in his fleet. Niño, Escobedo, Gutierrez, Sanchez, Torres, Cuellar, Medina, Pérez, Franco, Ruiz, Martín, Martínez, Peña, Bermúdez, Gallego, Leal, Cuellar, Garcia, Rodriguez, and tons of others that were on his fleets with names just like ours. I say all of this to stress about the probability that many of you are like them, our ancestors that came with people like Cristobal Colón, Christopher Columbus, all right? A most interesting fact is that Columbus, his wife and his mother and mother-in-law all confessed to the Inquisition in Spain that they were Judías, that they were Jews. So I kind of wonder, I mean, how can it not be that Christopher Columbus came from a very Jewish family but became crypto? All right? So we've discovered in personal letters to his son, Don Diego in Spain, that he would put secret codes and words that were not Espanol, they were Hebreo, they were not Spanish, they were Hebrew, like Be'erat Hashem, with the help of God, with the favor of God, and B, a hyphen or a little apostrophe H, Baruch Hashem, all right, meaning bless God, praise the name of the Lord. So this progression of history has taken place to the point that now there's a major awakening. About 32 years after Colón's initial discovery, the crown from Spain sent 24 inquisitors to Mexico to fuel the Inquisition in Mexico City and throughout all of Mexico that lasted for about 300 years, okay? This long holocaust was so prolonged and so incredibly devastating that forced more of our forefathers to go underground and become what is known as crypto-Jews. The point is that many of our people went underground, hid the secret of identity so well, so long, they forgot what the secret was. So, back in Spain, our people were not allowed to cross the Atlantic. They were called la gente prohibida, prohibited from crossing the Atlantic Ocean. They could go to Europe or they could go into North Africa or anywhere. So then we find the secret that Don Luis de Carvajal y de la Cueva, he is a Sephardic conquistador, a compassionate conquistador, brought members of his family and his wife Guiomar's family across the Atlantic Ocean and came into Santa Catalina along with more hidden Jews, okay? King Philip II gave him an enormous land grant called the Tragic Square. Why tragic? Because of the tragedy of what happened to Don Luis and his sister, his family. Don Luis died being a viceroy, mind you, to King Philip II of Spain. He died in an Inquisition prison. His sister was burned at the stake along with her 3 daughters and a son. And then comes, thank God, for Don Juan de Onate that came across from Zacatecas, Mexico, through El Paso, Texas, crossed El Rio Bravo del Norte, the Rio Grande, and settled right plumb in the middle of New Mexico, namely in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So this becomes La Cuna, that is the cradle of the Sephardic Anusim crypto-Jews. So as I've said, I've discovered that mostly here in New Mexico, this secret has been kept so well kept for so long. But now our friends are discovering who they really are. For example, the Martinez family that has good theology, or rather genealogies, and theology too, as far as the paternal and maternal families, and how my wife's maternal side, Martinez, are from the northern New Mexico area as well, and also crypto-Jews. So in our impassioned research, we have gone all over the world, literally, okay? We have gone into Mexico, Spain, many times into Israel, looking for facts as to who we really are. The point is that our people were so tormented by the tortures and the travesties against our people in Mexico, they fled across the Rio Grande into New Mexico and Texas and other parts of the Southwest. Helen and I are witnesses that we have been inside the concentration camp of sorts called San Juan de Ulua, the prison camp, or the prison in Veracruz, Mexico. We've been in front of the very location where they would burn the victims at the stake by the Mexican Inquisition, in front of the Convento San Diego in el Sector Colonial, or the colonial section of Mexico City. We've discovered objects with such as mezuzahs and Hebrew symbols and paintings and gravestones with Hebrew symbols here in the state of New Mexico. We've analyzed up to close to 17,000 surnames, apellidos, that are of our kind of surname, that is like Martinez, Sanchez, Escobedo, and so forth. We've compared DNA results, test results, and we've discovered that many of our people have similar DNA haplotypes or haplogroups that are similar to other Sephardic Jews in other nations. But we've also discovered that many of our people, or rather not many in terms of how many in volume, but that they exist, that there are common diseases, such as, for example, the BRCA1 and the BRCA2 breast and ovarian cancer that is found predominantly among Jewish women. And we've found that here in northern New Mexico and in southern Colorado, this is very prevalent. So this concerns us, but it's another proof that we have and we are of these kind of vestiges of Sephardic Jews or Ashkenazic Jews. So needless to say, I believe that now what God is doing in the country, in the nation of Israel, He's arising, He's raising up the leaders. In fact, Helen and I, my wife and I, were in a famous lawyer's office in downtown Jerusalem. He's the chairman of a board of a major Anusim department of Netanya Academic College in Israel. And in the middle of us three talking around his conference table in his office, he suddenly stood up. And I thought, well, I guess he's dismissing us. This is the end of our conversation. And he says, "Welcome home, my brother. Welcome home, my sister." You cannot imagine how loudly this resonates in my ears, in my heart to this very day. Folks, I wish I could go on with this story, but I will tell you that God cares, and my desire for you is that one day you too will come into the liberation and the freedom of your identity and your destiny, just as I did, and I wish the best for you and your wholeness be yours and your family. Hasta luego, shalom, leitraot.
Bernadette, this is an incredible story about the journey of our people here in New Mexico.
Yes, it is. It was a secret so well hidden that we almost forgot it. But even more fascinating is that there is another secret within this secret. And our next guest will bring to light something that has been hidden until the early 90s. Dr. Michael Linver is Director of Mammography for X-Ray Associates of New Mexico and Clinical Professor of Radiology at the University of New Mexico. He has been a specialist in breast imaging for the past 27 years. Dr. Linver is a lecturer on mammography, having presented over 900 lectures in 36 states in the U.S. and in 20 foreign countries around the world. He is the author of over 60 published articles and chapters of textbooks on mammography. Dr. Linver, welcome to this program.
I'm Dr. Michael Linver. I'm the Director of Mammography for X-Ray Associates of New Mexico, and I'm a clinical professor of radiology at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. I'm going to be talking about hereditary breast cancer in New Mexico. And to start off with, first of all, how much breast cancer is related to heredity? Well, it's not a huge amount. When you look at the general population, only about 5 to 7% of all breast cancers are related to heredity, although there are several family clusters, probably to the tune of about 15 to 20%. But in addition, there's a tie-in with ovarian cancer in many women who have breast cancer that is also hereditary, and these are often linked together. So we'll be talking a little about both. But to do that, I wanted to set the stage by giving you a very quick review of genetics and hereditary breast cancer, how these are related, so you would have a better understanding of what we're talking about here in New Mexico. The structure of the gene begins in the cell itself. And as you know, within the cell there is a so-called nucleus. Within the nucleus is where the chromosomes lie, where the genes live. These chromosomes, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in every cell in your body. The chromosomes are made of DNA, as you know, and this is the so-called double helix, where there's two strands that wrap around each other that are tied together in between. These strands then make up the chromosome. There are literally thousands of genes on every chromosome in every cell in your body. And within these genes, there are the secrets of our heredity. And these are composed of 4 different elements. These are the so-called bases, the adenine and thymine, guanine, and cytosine. These are the chemicals that tie these 2 strands together and comprise what we know of as the genetic code. So this is where all of heredity comes from. It's the structure of the gene we're going to be dealing with. Within each cell, as I mentioned, within each nucleus, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. These are a picture from a woman who has such a set. And you can see that within these, there are also the 2 X chromosomes at the very end, which make this person a woman rather than a man who would have the X and the Y chromosome. But the others are all the same. And what was discovered is there are 2 sets of chromosomes, number 13 and number 17, that actually have genes that control for hereditary breast cancer, so-called BRCA genetic sites. And this was discovered in the 1990s on chromosome 17 at a certain locus on that gene was found that what's called the BRCA1 or BRCA1 gene. This was discovered in 1990, and it was isolated by Mary Claire King and her team in 1994. And about 50% of all hereditary breast cancer is related to this particular gene. And it also is related to ovarian cancer, as I mentioned. Then in 1994, a second genetic site, another gene was found that controls breast cancer, and that is the BRCA2 gene. It's on chromosome 13, and it was discovered, as I mentioned, in 1994, and it was isolated in 95, and it's responsible for slightly less than half of the hereditary breast cancers that we know about. And this one also occurs not only in women, but to a lesser extent in men, different from the BRCA1. And there's less ovarian cancer, but there's still a tie-in with ovarian cancer as well. So let's talk for a moment about the genetic, how genes are transmitted. Well, there's the dominant gene, you've heard of that, and then there's the recessive gene. What's the difference? Well, in the dominant gene, whichever parent has that particular gene, and here's the 2 little genes right side by side, and the 2 chromosomes, the red one is the dominant one. And it doesn't matter which child gets that particular one of those two strands from that parent, that gene is going to be manifest in that child. It's going to show up as a clinical, as a finding, as opposed to the other parent who does not have that gene. So the dominant gene is going to be the dominant one for those children. So whichever child gets that particular gene from the parent, and they're going to only give one of those 2 strands to the child, they're going to have that mutation. They're going to have that genetic trait, whether it's brown eyes instead of blue eyes, that's what controls it. Then there is a so-called recessive gene. And the recessive genes are hidden unless both parents donate that particular red strand you see here. There's the red strand and the blue strand from each parent. And that child, and there's a chance of only 1 out of 4 of those children having that recessive gene. If they have both of those, then they will show that particular trait, like blue eyes, for instance. Both parents have to contribute to that to get the blue eyes, not just the one. So that's the difference between dominant and recessive. Now, what is it that we're dealing with when it comes to the breast cancer model? It is the dominant gene. So that is, whichever parent has that particular gene, it's going to be transmitted to that child. It doesn't have to be from both parents, only from one. And that's the difference. Now, what's interesting is you'd say, well, okay, if that parent transmits that gene, the child's going to have that trait, whatever it is. The parent had breast cancer, the child's going to have breast cancer. Well, yes and no, because it's true. In women who get that gene, 80% of them will get breast cancer, but not 100%. And in men who get that gene, less than 1% ever get breast cancer. Well, does that make any sense? Well, it does because of something called penetrance. That is, even though they have the gene, and you'd think they'd all get breast cancer, they don't. And the reason is that that normal cell, it is undergoing a mutation, a change in its structure that's created by that particular mutation that occurred on that gene. That's only one, what we call a hit, to create the cancer. It didn't do it quite there. It takes more hits. Something else has to be involved. There has to be a second mutation, a third mutation, sometimes even a fourth or more mutations before all of a sudden, boom, that cell becomes truly cancerous. So that doesn't happen all the time. It happens 80% of the time in women, less than 1% of the time in men. Why does that happen? We don't really know. There are genes called tumor suppressor genes, which may, if they're not present, the tumor is more likely to develop. There's something called an oncogene that's involved. And then there's all these hereditary, besides hereditary factors, there are environmental factors. All the stuff we breathe in the air, all the stuff we eat, many of those chemicals can cause cancer. They can cause these mutations that can eventually lead to breast cancer. We don't know all the causes. All we know is 80% of the women, not 100%, get breast cancer, less than 1% of the men, and that is what is known as penetrance. Different degrees, it penetrates differently in each person. That said, and you're going to hear more about this later, is we can look at family trees to establish whether or not there might be a genetic mutation present. Here's a typical family tree, or what they call family pedigree in medicine, for the BRCA1 gene. And the black dots you see represent people who have died. I'm sorry, those are the ones who actually have the gene. And you can see it's been passed down here for many generations. This person wanted to know whether they might have the gene. You can see the black dots in every generation where a woman did have a breast cancer. And sure enough, when she started looking at all of these, the mother, the grandmother, the great-grandmother, and all of the relatives, 2 of her sisters also, you can see that in this family tree, that gene most likely was present. And if she were tested for it, she would most likely have it. So this is a person who's certainly at risk. Here's another family where it doesn't look like there's much in the way of heredity, because the only person who had breast cancer, and this is the BRCA2 gene, was the woman herself. And she started asking, why do I have breast cancer? And sure enough, it was found in her father, who never showed breast cancer, because like I said, men don't usually show up with the breast cancer, even though they have this dominant gene that he passed on to his daughter, who then did develop breast cancer. So by looking at family trees, you can get an idea about whether you might have the gene. The importance of that is that, like I said, 80% of the women who have that genetic mutation, the BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene, will get breast cancer by the age of 80, and 50% will get breast cancer before the age of 50. This is a young woman's disease for these women who have the BRCA gene. Now, in addition, you can see this is the chart showing the normal distribution of breast cancer in women over time. Only about 1 out of 8 women get breast cancer by the age of 80. So this is 10 times more likely to occur in a woman who's got this BRCA1 genetic mutation compared to the normal population, the general population. And not only breast cancer, but ovarian cancer, as I mentioned. By the age of 80, almost 50% of women with the BRCA1 gene will have gotten ovarian cancer. And for the BRCA2 gene, it's a little lower, more like about 25%. But still much, much higher than the general population. This is the distribution of ovarian cancer in the general population, way, way low, about 2%. So you can see the huge problems that this genetic mutation can cause in women. Now, what does this have to do with New Mexico? Well, I want to talk a little bit about breast cancer in Jewish women, women who are not necessarily Jewish but are of Jewish ancestry, because the rate of breast cancer in this group is very high. They say about 15% overall than the general population, and because of a genetic link directly to the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. 2.5%, 1 out of 40 women of Ashkenazic Jewish ancestry does carry that mutation, 1 out of 40. That's 10 times higher, as I mentioned before, 10 times higher than the general population. As I mentioned, 80% by the age of 80, 50% by the age of 50. The most important statement here is tumors are much more aggressive. If a woman has this genetic mutation and gets breast cancer, it's going to be an aggressive cancer that is much more likely to kill if it's not caught early. That's the real significance of this. And like I said, 25 to 50% will also get ovarian cancer, which is another very deadly cancer. What's interesting is that it's not only in the Ashkenazic Jewish ancestry, but also in the Sephardic Jewish ancestry that this gene has shown up. There are what are called founder genetic mutations. That is, these are the ones that can be traced back all the way through history. There are 3 different ones that can be traced back. There's the BRCA1 185 del AG, there's the 5382 INC, and I won't explain what those are, just trust me that those are specific genes on this genetic site. And then on the BRCA2 gene, there's the 6174 del T. The importance of these is that, again, 2.5% of all women of Jewish ancestry does carry one of these genetic mutations. So how do we know that these genetic mutations have the same Jewish ancestors? How do we know it's come from someplace else? Well, because there are thousands of potential BRCA mutations on that genetic site, and yet only these 3 are found exclusively in Jews worldwide. And that is the BRCA1, the 185, the 5382, and the 6174. These are exclusive. It's like a fingerprint. If you've got that, there is Jewish ancestry related, no question about it. And the reason we know that, we've been able to trace these genes back, some other genes even, for 3,000 to 4,000 years. In fact, the gene and here's a chart showing you the migrations in Jewish history and how these relate to these particular genetic mutations. The genetic mutation for cystic fibrosis, you've heard of cystic fibrosis, can be traced back to the time of Abraham, 4,000 years ago. Unbelievable. They've been able to find evidence. There's a Kohanim Y linkage on the Y chromosome that can be traced back to the time of the Exodus. And here we go. The BRCA1 and BRCA2 genetic mutations have been traced back to the time of the destruction of the first temple and the exile of all the Jews from Israel to Babylonia, which occurred about 2,700 years ago. This was the time when this genetic mutation first occurred, and it kept going and is still present in women of Jewish ancestry today. Unbelievable story of almost 3,000 years. Because what happened, that founder genetic mutation stayed in that population, because most of the time those were pockets of Jewish individuals who stayed together, so the gene stayed within that population. Some moved to Eastern Europe, became the Ashkenazic Jews. Some then moved all around the Mediterranean, and the Ashkenazic Jews again came to the New World, but so did those from the Mediterranean, the so-called Sephardic Jews, and there was a huge number of those in Spain in the 1300s and 1400s, which was called the Golden Age of Spain for Spanish Jewry. But unfortunately, during the time of the Inquisition, they were expelled from Spain, and many of those Sephardic Jews came to the New World at that time, carrying with them that genetic mutation, so that it's found in many Latinos here in the United States and throughout the New World. So why did these killer mutations, if they were going to kill women, why did they survive? Why did they survive 3,000 years? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, not all the women who have this genetic mutation die. Some, at least 20%, survive long enough to pass it on to their daughters and their sons. And it also may have some protective value. Not only is it a bad thing, it might also be a good thing. Like you may know about sickle cell anemia. That is a genetic mutation that occurs in Africa. And yet it didn't die out because it protects these people also from malaria, which was another killer disease. So by having one disease, it protected from the other, so therefore that disease survived. In addition, it's been thought that this BRCA mutation may have an advantage in fertility for women and lactation. So there was a survival advantage as well. And it's also interesting, some research shows that there may be more brain neurons that develop in women with this BRCA gene, so they're smarter. So this has some advantage as well. So what about this mutation that occurs in Sephardic Jews, as I mentioned, those of Sephardic Jewish ancestry? The most common is the 185 del AG. The importance of that is that it is not only prevalent in Ashkenazic Jews, but also Sephardic. And here in New Mexico, as you've heard from Del, it has occurred in the colonial Spanish population due to the heritage of the so-called crypto-Jews here in New Mexico. And we are now seeing, I can tell you in the medical community where I work, I am seeing many colonial Spanish breast cancer patients with this deadly BRCA genetic mutation. It is really quite something. And again, as Del mentioned to you, there were the expeditions of Onate and Coronado, which brought many people from Mexico, who were originally from Spain, into New Mexico in the 1600s. So how big a risk factor is that? If you compare it to other known risk factors for breast cancer, having that genetic mutation gives you a relative risk of, as I mentioned, 5 to 10 times the normal population. Having a mother or sister with breast cancer that's not genetically related, 2 to 3 times. Having no children or first birth after 30, 2 to 3 times. Having a history of breast or ovarian cancer increases it by 2 to 4 times. Early menarche, that's having periods earlier or keeping them going till later, you have menopause later, 2 times. Being obese or drinking a lot of alcohol increases it by 2 times. Having dense breasts on a mammogram, 2 to 4 times. But it's striking. The number one reason you can see here, the biggest risk, is just having this genetic mutation. So knowing that, what can women do to decrease their risk of breast cancer? First of all, you can decrease any of these known risk factors, like that is lack of exercise, obesity, alcohol consumption, having no children, late first birth, and also screening for breast and ovarian cancer early. Because we know from all the data around the world, if you find a cancer early, it can be cured at a much, much higher rate than when we find it late. So good early screening can make a huge difference. That is yearly mammography beginning at 40, yearly mammography and adding an MRI if you have the genetic mutation, and having a yearly pelvic ultrasound and probably a breast ultrasound if you have that BRCA genetic mutation as well. You can find ovarian cancer and breast cancer at an earlier stage. So here you can see the effects of some of these risk factors even in women with the BRCA gene. If women with the BRCA gene have 1 or more children, then their risk of getting breast cancer early is quite a bit lower. Here, if they don't have children, you can see by the age of 40, 80% of them will have gotten their breast cancer already. Whereas if they have 1 or more children, then it goes up to about age 70 that 80% will have gotten their breast cancer. So it makes a big difference in terms of how many children you have, and also physical activity. Women with the BRCA gene, those who exercise, get it a little bit later. Here you can see women who are not active physically, age of 50, almost 80% have gotten it already, and if they're active physically, up to at age 75 by the time they get that 80% getting breast cancer. So what are the tests that we can use to screen then? I mentioned these already. The first is the mammogram. It's a very effective weapon. It catches most of the breast cancers, not all. It's like, and here's a patient gave me this one time. She called it a breast Waldogram because it's sort of like what we do in breast imaging. We're trying to find Waldo. And remember, where's Waldo? Here he is right here. Very tough to see in that background. But we blow it up. Now you can see Waldo. And that's the kind of what we're doing with mammography. Here's a very busy breast, all kinds of densities. We're looking for that new density, and here it is. You can see it occurred 3 years later, and I saw this little new density, about 6 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch in size. But doing special tests, we found that this was indeed a tiny invasive cancer. Just starting, that's how screening mammography works when women have it on a yearly basis. We can find these little tiny, highly curable cancers on mammography. Sometimes we see it as an architectural distortion. See this sort of spider-like lesion down here. Here it is right along the edge of the film on the other view. And when we worked this up, we did a biopsy of this, and we found, again, here's the specimen after it was taken out with surgery. This was a tubular carcinoma just beginning again. And sometimes we see it only in the form of calcifications, which is why mammography is still an important weapon. It sees calcifications where the other tests don't. Here's this little tiny cluster right here. This turned out to be what we call DCIS, early non-invasive cancer just about to become invasive and a potential killer. So screening on a regular basis works, there's no question. Here's a woman who had breast cancer when she was 43, and she came in every year for a mammogram. You can see the clips where they took out the original cancer. When she came back the next year after 2003, she came back 2004, what do we see? We see a new little tiny dot right up there. And brand new, you go back to the year before, nothing there. So what did we do? We worked it up, and when we did the ultrasound, you can see this little tiny mass, and on biopsy, this proved to be a little tiny, a very aggressive, what we call high-grade cancer, just beginning 6 millimeters in size. That's 1/4 of an inch. So we were able to save her life by finding this with regular yearly screening in this highly at-risk individual that already had 1 breast cancer. Breast ultrasound, Also can be used for screening for women with dense breasts and women at very high risks, as I mentioned, especially the BRCA1 patients and BRCA2 patients. Here's a patient who had a mother and a sister with breast cancer, hadn't been tested for BRCA1 yet, but she knew about screening. She came in for a mammogram, and we told her it was normal. She said, I also want a screening ultrasound. Well, unfortunately, insurance doesn't pay for screening ultrasound yet in the United States, but she was willing to pay out of pocket for that, and we did that. And we found this little tiny mass right here, and sure enough, that turned out to be a high-grade DCIS. No other evidence on the mammogram, found only on ultrasound. So screening ultrasound is useful also. And then we have MRI. This is our best tool. It's also our most expensive tool, which is why we can't use it on everyone. We use it in certain conditions that are listed here. Especially once a diagnosis of cancer has been made, we can look for the additional cancer that might be present so that the right surgery is done. You don't want to do a lumpectomy in a patient who's got a cancer in the other half of the breast and that is missed, and then the patient dies of that cancer. So that's why we use MRI. Here's a typical MRI showing a little cancer right here, and we see all the rest of the breast tissue, no other cancer, so now she could just have a lumpectomy and do very well. The nice thing about MRI, we can help lay out the anatomy for the surgeon. We're using, in MRI, we're using the blood flow, the abnormal blood flow of tumors. And here you can see a map of the blood flow that shows us that this is a cancer. Here you can see a nice little diagram showing how we can make a hologram for the surgeons and show them exactly where the tumor lies in space, so they can do much better surgery using the MRI. And in addition, we can show them a little map of where the tumor lies and show them a little cage around it, what we call an encapsulating ellipsoid, so the tumor is all removed. The surgeon gets a good view of this before surgery so they can do the right surgery. Here's an example of how good MRI can be at helping the patient. Here's an obvious big mass right here that the patient could feel was palpable. This was, on biopsy, turned out to be a cancer. But was that the only cancer present? Lots of other ditzels and dotzels here that could be cancer. But when we did the MRI, what did we find? Here's that index, what we call the index cancer, the original cancer. But here, way away on the other side of the breast, another cancer. If she had had only the lumpectomy, that other cancer would have been missed. She potentially could have died of that cancer because that wouldn't have been treated. So again, MRI very good in showing the full extent of cancer when it's present. The other really good application that we're finding more and more is screening patients who are positive for the BRCA genetic mutation. This is our best test, MRI. Here's an example. Patient of mine, she was 49 years old. She was a colonial Hispanic. She had the BRCA1 185LAG mutation. She had a 29-year-old daughter who was found with a palpable lump that turned out to be cancer. She came in for a mammogram in 2004. You can see you don't see a lot of density here. We don't see a lot of things that look bad. In fact, this is an easy mammogram to read. I thought she looks great. Well, she had her MRI, and what did we find? A little mass right here. You couldn't see it on the mammogram at all. And we did our usual evaluation, and here you can see the blood flow of that is an abnormal blood flow pattern. Did the biopsy. And based on the ultrasound, we were able to find it on ultrasound, little tiny tumor, but this was a high-grade invasive ductal carcinoma in this patient with the BRCA genetic mutation seen only on the MRI. So these are very useful tests in patients like this. So what else can a high-grade, high-risk woman do to decrease her risk? Well, obviously, if she's got the BRCA1 mutation, she's got to be screened more aggressively. And there are studies from New York City and also from Holland and Europe that showed that we can find much earlier cancers, smaller cancers, by screening every 6 months, beginning at 30. And this is what they're recommending, alternating the mammogram and the ultrasound with an MRI, one or the other, every 6 months. It's by far our best way of handling this, finding it early, curing these women because you find the cancer before it spreads. In addition, if you're thinking about any of this, you think you might have any risks, consult your physician about measuring your actual risk. They have different models they can do. They can calculate what your lifetime risk is. There's the Tyrer-Cuzick, the Klaus, there's a bunch of them. And many physicians can do this now. If you have a positive family history, you can go through this risk profile and maybe even consider genetic testing, being tested for the genetic mutation of BRCA1 or BRCA2. The best way to do this is to test the person who's got the breast cancer first, if that person is still alive. If that person is BRCA positive, then they should consider undergoing the test themselves. And you should know your choices before you even get tested for the BRCA gene. What are you going to do with that information? Very, very important. There are many choices to be made. First of all, you can just have more frequent screening, as I mentioned, with mammography and ultrasound, and especially with MRI, which is now, by the way, being paid for by insurance companies if you can show that you are at high risk with the BRCA genetic mutation. You can have prophylactic surgery, remove the targets of the cancer. That is having a bilateral mastectomy, which is 99+% effective, or having the ovaries removed, which is almost 99% effective too. These are ways to obviously avoid the problem altogether. It's pretty drastic, but it can be done. Then you can avoid all the known risks, and I went through what those risks are. That's another way. And you can even do what's called chemo prevention. There are certain medications that are shown unequivocally to decrease the risk of breast cancer by about 50%. Something called tamoxifen, another one called raloxifene. So there are many choices to be made here. The important thing is to be informed and take action. Take accountability for your own life and those of your family. It could save your life, or could certainly save someone you love.
Thank you, Dr. Livner. You know, Berna, this is one of those situations where knowledge really is power. Knowing if you're BRCA1 positive gives you some control to make decisions for your life, you know, rather than sticking your head in the sand and waiting for something to happen.
Annette, I am the poster child for this. In fact, Dr. Linver holds a very special place in my heart. 18 years ago, he found a small tumor which turned out to be a very aggressive cancer. Over the years, with the counsel of my doctor, I have taken preventative measures, which I believe is why I am still here today. 5 years ago, I found out I was BRCA1 positive, as was my dad. My sister also had breast cancer, and she is BRCA1 positive. My youngest sister was tested, and she is negative. The rest of my siblings are in the process of getting tested. With this knowledge, we can take the necessary steps to set up preventative health care programs and also make sure our kids are tested. This really is life-saving information. But before we did this, my brother and I began to work on our genealogy. And we met Henrietta Martinez Christmas and had just a great time with that. And because of our work with Henrietta, she's been very instrumental in a lot that we've done here in New Mexico. And so I am very pleased to introduce Henrietta as our next guest. Henrietta is an independent genealogist and historian who has worked mainly in colonial military records for New Mexico. Henrietta has volunteered her time acting as a research assistant for projects at the New Mexico History Museum, the Palace of the Governors, and the Daughters and Sons of the American Revolution for soldiers pertaining to New Mexico. She lectures on topics related to colonial women, colonial military, and genealogy of Hispanic families in New Mexico. Henrietta, welcome to this program.
Hi, I'm Henrietta Martinez Christmas, and I'm a genealogist and an independent historian. Today I will be talking about migration patterns in New Mexico, basically starting from 1540 to about the mid-1800s. One of the best ways to truly understand this type of migration pattern is if you do your own genealogy and read several history books of early New Mexico. Let's get started. So why do we want to look at migration? There are many reasons why people migrate even today, and one is to better understand where your ancestors came from. This can be anything from why redheads run in your family, blue eyes, why you have the surname you do, if someone is tall or short, or just a basic understanding of how they arrived in New Mexico. Finding the migration patterns for this area is a result of understanding our history. New Mexico was first discovered in the 1540s, and its appeal made more people want to come back and take another look. So finding those patterns, and in this case taking a look at the earliest of the settlers who came in 1598, would be a good place to start. At that time, the immigrant group would have been considered from Spain, Spaniards born in Mexico, also known as criollos, or a mix of Mexican Native Americans with either of the first two groups. This could also include some Africans. With the data that has been collected thus far, in 1598, New Mexico saw a huge migration of people enter and settle down. So where did they go? New Mexicans came from Mexico. Their ancestors came from Spain, Portugal, the Canary Islands. Spain's history is a huge melting pot, so they came from all over Europe, the Middle East, and so on. People migrate for many reasons, and here are just a few on the slide. Migration as a topic by itself has been studied quite a bit and continues even today as people move around. With the data that has been collected by genealogists and historians, research has proven that the groups of people who came from Spain were varied. As some of you might know, the Moors were in Spain for 700 years. Therefore, the mix of the gene pool is blended. In fact, the first groups that came into Mexico were mostly men. So we can say that Spain is the father country and Mexico the mother country. Those men had to marry local women, as Spanish women were scarce in the New World. What did they bring with them? Other research has told us that the Spanish language has many Arabic and Native American words. This is a result of the blending of the cultures. You take something from one group that works for your family and combine it with your own. The early 1598 settlers into New Mexico were basically all from mining towns in Mexico. Did they all know how to mine? Were they soldiers? Did they also know how to farm and raise cattle and sheep? So when they set up their towns, they continued or adopted things that were familiar to them. The settlement patterns in New Mexico was done with government permission. Juan de Onate received permission at that time in 1598 to bring the largest group of settlers north. They hoped to find riches as they had in Mexico. Again, how many of those early settlers knew how to mine? Onate himself came from a wealthy mining family, and some items he brought with him were for this purpose. The bottom line is that they all had something in common: language, religion, customs, and definitely a sense of adventure. Let's take a look at some timelines. In looking at this abbreviated timeline for New Mexico, as early as 1540, we start seeing explorers enter into the area. But as far as we know, none of those people stayed behind. In 1598, we see the next larger group come in with Onate. And then from that time period, 1598 to 1680, yet people would come and go all the time, but not a structured form of migration. But by the 1680 time period, the largest Indian revolt had taken place, and almost all of these family groups from this time period were pushed out involuntarily, a migration not of their choosing. The 1692 to 1821 timeline, we have Don Diego de Vargas bringing several hundred families to resettle New Mexico. This is now another migration. I call this the immigration of a city. The occupations of these people were so varied and diverse, they were ready to fill the needs of those settlers who were going to re-enter New Mexico. They would not do without and wait for caravans that might come and go every several years. The pre-revolt families who returned were now outnumbered. And once again, New Mexico saw a melting pot of people into this province. This newer, larger group were very similar to those of the earlier period, a mix of Spaniards, Criollos, Mestizos, and much more. Timelines after 1821 get a little bit different. New Mexico was governed by Mexico up to 1848 when the United States came in and we became part of that governing body. The Mexican period, as we call it, has the Santa Fe Trail opening up, and with that we see new names and settlers come into the area. In 225 years, we see a pattern here. At every opportunity, someone is coming or going out of New Mexico. So let's take a look at a few maps to get a visual feel for this. This first map depiction is the long ship ride from Spain to Cuba and into Mexico. This bridge is the hardest to work with, and when researching your family, mainly based on that time period and access to records, it gets a little bit more difficult. But with all migration, they come and they go. This slide is 1540 to 1700. This is our north to south and south to north migration pattern for New Mexico. The next slide is 1692 to 1850. We do have some people that migrate from the east, but mostly after the Santa Fe Trail opening. And then from 1850 to current time, the eastern migration becomes much heavier. So what does this tell us? In New Mexico, we have some surname pockets of people that still exist even today. For example, in the Pohuaca Valley, which extends from Cuyamongue to San Ildefonso, the Roybal, Mestis, Archuleta, and Gomez names all come from single progenitor lines, and you can still see these names fairly prominent in the area. Bottom line, if you are working on your family genealogy and you see one of these names in the 1800s or 1900s, you're more than likely to end up in the Pohuaca area when doing your research. Santa Fe was a bit more varied. You have all the early military families that lived there. Names such as Sena, Rivera, Ortiz remained in Santa Fe pretty much until the end of the 1700s. Then you have names like Martinez that are just so vast and varied that you find them everywhere. As families married, they migrated to new areas within New Mexico. This concludes the migration portion of this project. Combining an understanding of your history, migration of your family, future generations can benefit from your efforts in better understanding how their family came into New Mexico and what issues they may face going forward.
Bernadette, this has been a fascinating program. Why now?
Annette, the Hispanics of New Mexico have a very, very interesting history, especially northern New Mexico, one that is not only documented through history, but is also genetically documented. This is an important message, one that needs to be known. I believe this message will save lives rather than becoming victims. People who are BRCA1 positive can take some control by the decisions they make, just as I did. Prevention starts with knowing the facts and who is at risk. With this knowledge, there will be many more survivors.
Wow, Berna, thank you for making this program available. And a special thank you to Dr. Del Sanchez, Dr. Michael Livner, and Henrietta Christmas.
Todos con gusto y placer a felicitarte. El día en que tú naciste, nacieron todas las flores. Y en la pila del bautismo cantaron los ruiseñores. Viene amaneciendo y a la luz del día nos dio. Levántate de mañana, mira que amaneció. De las estrellas del cielo tengo que una para saludarte y otra para decirte adiós. Ya viene amaneciendo y a la luz del día nos dio. Viene a